Chapter 6. A Renaissance Lifestyle. Few consciously think about complex strategies in daily living. On a daily basis, a functional strategy is invisible. Rarely do we step back and re-examine our strategy or lifestyle design. Most of the time we simply adopt the tactics that are handed down through the system without a second thought. Now, it's possible to improve normal consumer budgets by several percent by utilizing tips and hacks to optimize the efficiency of existing tactics. Keep in mind, however, that hacking existing methods isn't going to accomplish the same level of satisfaction as devising new methods that are more suitable to the new strategy. One doesn't win a trench war against machine guns by improving the cavalry. Substantial improvements don't happen incrementally by patching existing methods. They require a complete redesign. Until now, we have concentrated on the theoretical foundations and guiding principles of the Renaissance life. In this chapter, I'll describe the trees of this forest. Just as early humans built fires and shelter and planted seeds to modify their environment, we should modify our environment in ways that are beneficial rather than detrimental to our goals. When the environment can't be changed, we'll adapt ourselves to flow along with the environment instead of struggling against it. It should be realized that it'll rarely be possible to change the environment on a grand scale and build a utopia. That is, unless you and the rest of the world all do what I say. Most tactics will therefore be executed in the current environment. However, they'll often be carried out with an entirely different goal in mind, becoming independently wealthy and financially independent within 5 years. The methods for doing so will be simple. I won't present any tips that haven't been heard before and which one can't find described in detail in hundreds of other books. Success won't depend on becoming famous on the internet or getting a book deal, nor will it depend on a timely participation in a market bubble of junk bonds, internet companies, real estate, gold, or tulips. It also won't depend on successfully starting your own business. You won't need to develop a particular specialized skill such as real estate flipping. In fact, if you have a job, keep it. However, using the methods in a way that aligns your goals and side effects persistently and consistently to achieve financial or job independence is not easy. You must be willing to change your frame of mind and conquer old habits. In particular, you must be willing to do things that 95% of the population won't be able to understand and 99% won't be willing to do. This means that you must be exceedingly confident that you're doing the right thing, which is why 90% of this book is dedicated to the development of a coherent philosophy. Freedom is attained by creating a large gap between production, revenue, and consumption, expenses. This can be done in 2 ways, earning more or spending less. Nothing new there. Which of the 2 you prefer depends on individual circumstances. If you're easily capable of producing more, you'll frame freedom as the opportunity to produce more. If producing more requires significant effort, you'll frame freedom as not having to produce more. In an affluent and wealthy society, the latter is much more easily achieved by most, including myself. There was and is no way I could increase my income by a factor of 4, but it was certainly possible to reduce my expenses to a quarter of their former level. I think this holds for the greater part of the bell curve of incomes. Unless you're very poor, with income under $4,000 a year, or very rich, with income over $400,000 a year, boosting income is very difficult. If done intelligently, a little money will go a long way. Unfortunately, in this age, money is rarely spent intelligently. So by practicing intelligent asset management, it's possible to live wealthily without spending nearly as much as the average. On an absolute scale, spending less also allows for much greater choice in how you earn your money. Currently, the money I spend could be acquired through a part-time job as a burger flipper. Just imagine the riches a full-time job could bring. Alternatively, I currently acquire my income as an amateur asset manager or capitalist using a little over 5 years of personal savings as my capital base. Since being a capitalist takes very little effort when you don't have to write progress reports or win new customers, I can dedicate most of my time to my primary passion, which is writing. The strategy described in this chapter focuses on living inexpensively in a culture dedicated to extravagance, productivity, and material waste. It follows these guidelines. Reduce wants and needs from the marketplace to a minimum to decouple the buy-work connection. Decrease the volume and size, but increase the sophistication of your activities and possessions. Measure prosperity by less activity, not more. Do fewer useless things. Work for the purpose of earning money for no more than 5 years of your life or 5 hours a week. Avoid generating waste and find ways to use the waste of others. Learn to use the system to your advantage, but don't be evil. Serve yourself rather than having others serve you. Instead, help them. Keep running costs down, but pay for value. Maintain health to avoid the personal and monetary cost of sickness. Build up the capital to live as a capitalist or the skills to always find a new job. Focus on productive assets rather than stuff. Focus on developing skills rather than on passive entertainment. Gain the maximum in satisfaction with the minimum expenditure of money and energy. Reintegration is an important part of this design. Normal life has maximized separation due to an underlying engineering frame of mind, minimized degrees of freedom, and the economic idea of comparative advantage, with outsourcing being its latest manifestation. This separation occurs not just over the span of decades with schooling, working, and retirement happening in 3 separate time periods, but also on a daily basis, where people drive dozens of miles away from their home for a set amount of hours in their separate cars and then return late to their separate houses in the early evening to consume stuff acquired elsewhere. What worked for me was reintegrating much of this behavior to eliminate the personal inefficiencies this way of life creates. For instance, I lived close to work. Most of my work I do at home because it's mostly telecommuting work. I don't dress up for work, but according to season. I get around not by car but by foot and bicycle, which provides free exercise. I retired from my career, but I still work and I still learn. Hence, I no longer get divided and conquered under the guise of comparative advantage. In the following descriptions, I have omitted many details of implementation. Consider them left as exercises for the student, whose inclusion would otherwise result in this book being significantly longer. All the technical details can be learned from other books and websites in a matter of months. I trust that the listener, after hearing about a specific method, will be able to fill in the blanks. For instance, if I suggest making your own laundry detergent or a self-watering container, I trust the listener to find the pertinent details on the internet. This leaves the technicalities to the listener, and I can restrict myself to pointing out what to look for and how to devise a strategy. 6.1. Things. Doing anything usually requires a tool and someone using that tool. An experienced tool user will think of the tool as an extension of himself. Hence, it's hard to tell where the tool ends and the tool user begins. After all, what is a tool really, if nobody's using it? This line of thinking extends to all the things we surround ourselves with. If no one is living in it, a house is not a home, but rather a useless arrangement of sticks and bricks. It's said that a person with skills can do more with less, yet nobody is so skilled to be able to do everything with nothing, and many tools have indeed allowed people to do things better than they otherwise would. On the other hand, many have become unskilled by the easy availability of technological replacements, and so they sometimes end up doing things worse, as well as ending up with a large amount of stuff. There should therefore be a continuous drive toward internalizing skills. After all, you can always lose your tools, but skills stay with you. From a skill-based Renaissance perspective, possessions are problematic in the following ways. An acquisition should therefore be considered carefully. They cost money. They take up space. They require maintenance. They often act as a gateway to additional or more expensive things. They can be taken away from you. They are hard to get rid of. The first problem is that they cost money, which is a negative limiting factor. However, these days many consumer goods are very cheap from a historical perspective, so this is the least of the problems. With few exceptions, you can have any one thing you want, but few can have it all, not that most don't try. It's very hard for a person in an affluent society not to end up with a lot of stuff, and a lot of effort has to be put into avoiding this. Possessions take up space, and the indirect costs of storage can be substantial. It's sometimes jokingly said that a house is merely a roof to cover our possessions. Notice how possessions tend to increase and expand to cover all possible closet and storage space. Sooner or later, the house will feel cramped with clutter. This happens when storage becomes inefficient and more effort has to be put into playing Tetris with your stuff and fitting just one more item into an already full closet. At this point, consumers start talking about the need for more bedrooms. These bedrooms are costly. Not only are bigger houses more expensive, they also come with higher property taxes. It's traditional to heat the entire house to 20 degrees Celsius, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. In other words, money is paid and gas is burned to make one's possessions as comfortable temperature-wise as the inhabitants. Interestingly, storage costs are related to the volume and not the price of what you're storing. Transportation and often environmental costs are typically related to weight. As a consequence, I consider not only the price but also volume and mass when I buy something. The costs manifest mainly as real estate costs, that is, paying to put your stuff somewhere. And if you put it in your main residence and subscribe to central heating, the cost of keeping it at a comfortable temperature. Stuff is also hard to transport, so having a large amount of stuff makes it difficult to move, and therefore it acts as an anchor on your mobility. Maintenance includes everything from simple repair, if you can't do it yourself, to fuel costs and insurance. Lifestyle inflation is a well-known and well-exploited phenomenon. Just think about accessories and the next upgrade. Things can be taken away from you. They can be lost in a fire, stolen, or simply confiscated. I don't own anything tangible that would be heartbreaking to lose or which has substantial replacement costs. The sum total of my possessions, including my residence, would cost less than 10% of my net worth. The final problem is a curious aspect of living in a society of material abundance. Things are much harder to get rid of than they are to acquire in the first place. It's very easy for Aunt Martha to acquire the proverbial ugly vase, but it would be very hard for you to get rid of it, other than throwing it in the trash, and throwing useful things in the trash is simply irresponsible. A few notes on simple living. Simple living isn't about decluttering and reducing the amount of stuff in your life, or putting everything on autopilot. Popular approaches attempt to achieve some arrangement of meaningful things that are left after eliminating superfluous stuff or engagements. This can even turn into a substitute faith or a counter-reaction of anti-materialism. In our approach, we are in fact aiming to build as much internal complexity into the strategy as possible. This should be clear from Chapter 5. All this means that the total cost of stuff is much larger than its initial sticker price. Effectively, only a fraction of the things we own contribute to our actual quality of life, the things we use on a daily basis. Despite this, and perhaps due to short-sightedness or failure to take the systemic problem into account, owning many things is often confused with a high quality of life. Hence, reducing the amount of stuff is perceived as a major barrier. As a counter-reaction, a recent trend towards simplification is to own as few things as possible. Here, the barrier prevents owning more things. The optimal point is somewhere in the middle. In particular, it's important to realize that it's not the things themselves that are the problem. It is their side effects. So with this in mind, let's move to the next section. 6.1.1. Which things should I own? Given the aforementioned problems, things should have the appropriate quality and a low lifetime cost. Be durable. Be easy to dispose of either by selling, giving away, or trashing in a responsible manner. Be small and preferably lightweight. Be easy to make. Be serviceable locally and easy to maintain and repair, preferably by yourself. As with most lists of optimal qualities, it's rare to be able to satisfy all criteria. Criteria must therefore be prioritized. For the purposes of extreme early retirement or financial independence, the most important criteria is having a low lifetime cost, which usually implies a relatively high level of durability and having the appropriate quality. The most expensive tool in the box is the one you never use. But many times there is also a temptation to get, say, a shop-quality tool, even if the tool isn't used daily like it would be in a shop. For commonly used items, a higher quality tends to pay off in the long run. Surprisingly, disposability is quite important. If you buy things that can be sold again at a price which will recover most of your cost, you haven't paid a lot. Rather than being a consumer of the thing with the plan to eventually throw it away, you're essentially holding an asset with the intent of selling it. If you can enjoy the asset while holding it, so much the better. Small and lightweight is important because it keeps storage and transportation costs down. Reducing the need for storage allows for substantial cost savings, and keeping transportation costs down makes it easier to move. Think twice before getting anything that doesn't fit easily within a suitcase or which you can't carry. Depreciation schedules. The best way to think about cost is not the sticker price, but the depreciation schedule. The depreciation schedule follows this equation. Annual cost equals your cost minus the used price divided by the number of years in service. The depreciation principle is widely understood to apply to cars, given the popularity of the used car market. Most people have an idea of the blue book value of their car, that is, how much it can be sold for used. However, everything else has a market price even if it doesn't have an army of salesmen or corresponding blue book. Make it a point to know the market price of all your stuff. Doing so makes it a simple matter to calculate the annual depreciation cost, which is the true cost of ownership. Everything I own is for sale. In my mind, I'm only holding it temporarily. If I need something else for a while, I can always buy it on eBay or find it on FreeCycle or Craigslist. In this way, these become like giant libraries of stuff I can rent for a while at the cost of depreciation. With sufficient capital, the initial outlay never matters. What matters is the depreciation cost, because this determines how much value can be recovered. Even though this is nominally ownership, I prefer not to think of it this way, which allows me to avoid becoming attached to my stuff. Here are some examples of the right ways and the wrong ways to do it. Consider our dining room set. It was bought used for $75 from a couple who initially bought it for their kids when they moved out. However, by the time the kids moved out, the kids decided they wanted something else. We had it for 2.5 years, took good care of it, and sold it for $70. The expense of this set was $75 minus $70 divided by 2.5 years. This equals $2 per year. And so from a financial standpoint, it was practically free. This was the right way to do it. The wrong way is illustrated by our sofa purchase. We bought it on closeout at $300, previously $600, sold it at $100, and held it 3 years. Cost of $67 per year. That was comparably expensive. The person who bought it from us got a good deal, though. Be that person. Measuring use is important. It can be measured in time, as in the equation earlier, but sometimes it's more reasonable to measure the use in miles driven, or times used rather than years used. For instance, buying a food processor for $75 and selling it for $15 3 years later equals a depreciation cost of $75 minus $15 divided by 3 years. That is $20 per year. However, if it was only used 15 times during the 3 years, a more telling calculation would be $75 minus $15 divided by 15 uses, which equals $4 per use. That's one expensive food processor. An additional cost to factor in is a potential running cost, which is there even if the thing isn't used or rarely used. A car requires insurance even if it's rarely driven. Some things are inexpensive but require expensive maintenance parts. Other things are expensive but accept inexpensive maintenance parts. Most stuff has storage costs regardless of whether it's used or not. These factors all add up to the total rate of cost of ownership, which is measured in money or time. All the little luxuries. It's quite interesting to note that by choosing to modify your behavior and give up certain average but comparably incredibly expensive things like $20,000 cars or $50,000 for an extra bedroom, being able to afford, or more accurately, having access to little luxuries becomes a source of pleasure. How about owning one of the best pocket knives in the world, the Sebenza made by Chris Reeves? Regardless of how much someone spends on a pocket knife, it doesn't get much better than this. The Vitamix blender, retailing at more than $400, is similarly considered one of the best blenders that money can buy. Kuhn-Rikon pressure cookers are in the same league. All of these are in a league that is typically beyond what most people have heard of. Why freeze in normal winter clothes when you can wear expedition quality clothes that are comfortable in a wider range of temperatures and activities? The typical objection is that these things cost 10 times more than what someone normally would pay. However, they also last at least 10 times longer, so the cost isn't that high. To wit, my boots are 13 years old and my jacket is 14 years old. The cost over time is the same as a cheap unit, but the utility is much higher. The choice is therefore between using a high-quality item and rarely or never replacing it, or a typical low-quality item and replacing it often. Choose the former even though fashion encourages the latter. The great benefit in doing this is that one can slowly build up an inventory of great items. Buy the coat 1 year, next year buy the copper pants, then buy the tube amplifier, and so on. You can even think of such luxuries as inflation-proof savings in lieu of precious metals. This means that you won't have a complete inventory right away. Yet it's better than buying a complete but cheap inventory, or worse, borrowing to do so. For now, use whatever you currently have. When what you currently have breaks down or wears out, replace it with something great. Ideally, one would own one coat, one pot, and so on, and hand it down to the next generation rather than replacing it every time fashion changes. Mono-use and multi-use. Things should have multiple uses, so they can be combined with other things to solve many different problems. Using skill, a superior thing can be combined with other things in many ways. Here, a desktop computer is superior to a laptop computer. The difference is that a desktop computer is made of many smaller and widely compatible components that are user-replaceable, given the requisite skills. While the laptop can do as many things as the desktop, it is, as far as the average user is concerned, one unit, and so it doesn't integrate as well. Of course, one solution is to become skilled in the art of laptop hardware maintenance. Consider whether an item falls under mono-use or multi-use for clothing, tools, rooms, cars, bicycles, everything. Being the master of your stuff. I prefer things whose operation can be understood by looking at them. When this is not possible, like with electronics, unless you're an electrical engineer or have the equivalent knowledge, for example by becoming competent in amateur radio, I prefer things with replaceable components. If one part fails, it can be replaced to preserve the integrity of the system. Replacing parts corresponds to the technician level. Anyone can replace parts. The mechanic level is knowing which part to replace without trying to replace parts at random until it works. To truly master your stuff, it's worthwhile to try to build some of it yourself. This doesn't mean you should build your own TV, but you could build your own composting system or furniture. Later, you can build your own radio. There's a great deal of satisfaction in doing this. Furthermore, disposal becomes easier because knowing how to put things together typically means knowing how to take them apart. It also means that it's easier to select, tweak, and even create designs that are more appropriate for a particular purpose. In general, I only trust things as far as I can throw them. That's just me. More importantly, I don't trust things I can't see, like wall conduits. In general, I don't trust things that have been abstracted away behind a clever user interface. What this does is merely to insert another layer of experts between the things and the users. There are two kinds of people. 1. If something breaks, they call a repair guy or throw it out and buy something new. 2. If something breaks, they are the repair guy and fix it. If you're the latter type, you're the master of your stuff. 6.1.2. How to avoid getting things. It is very likely that you already have very many things. I know I did. The most important thing, therefore, is to avoid getting more things and compounding the problem. Realize that the strong desire to acquire new things can be replaced with an equally strong desire to avoid acquiring new things. This transition will take a few months to become habitually ingrained. The wish list method seems to be widely known. It's trivially easy to use, and I have been using it for a long time. First with actual pen and paper, later just mentally. Here's how it works. Instead of buying when I develop a spontaneous desire to purchase something, I put it on my wish list, along with the date of the wish. Don't buy anything unless it has been on the wish list for at least 30 days. You will likely find that you have either found an alternative to buying it in the meantime, perhaps by finding an alternative, or by learning how to do without it. Test yourself. Books used to be my favorite consumer item. I read several books a week. During a time when I had no access to libraries and was buying sufficient number of books to make my landlady inquire about the large number of deliveries I was receiving, I decided to go without books. I went from buying close to 100 books a year, about 30 times the average person, to buying 3 books in total over the course of a year, about the same amount as the average person. That was not fun. However, books aren't very expensive, so I decided that one book a month could be enough to satisfy my cravings, when combined with the newly developed interest in geopolitics, which could be satisfied by reading news online. The lesson was that there was an optimal point which is slightly less than the extreme point. Most people will still consider the optimal point extreme, but that's because they've never experienced the extreme. Try it out. Drink water exclusively for a month. Eat mostly or only rice and vegetables for a month. Stop smoking. Stop drinking. Stop eating and fast for a week. Don't spend any money for a week and try to improvise your solutions when needs arise. How long can you go without the consumer lifeline of the marketplace? Proceed intelligently and educate yourself from your responses. The most helpful thought for avoiding new stuff is to realize that you have lived fine without it for this long, so why get it now? This will eliminate 99% of all electronic gadget lust. 6.1.3 How to get rid of things. It's hard to determine where everybody got the bright idea to turn their houses into warehouses, but a very simple solution to this problem is to move all unused possessions into a storage unit, which is better suited for the purpose. This problem is relatively easy to solve, but is perhaps best attacked during a relocation. Go through all your possessions. For each possession, each book, each tool, each appliance, each toy, try to recall when you last used it, and put it into one of the following categories. It's important to be honest. To avoid ruining the statistics, a box with 500 nails should be counted as one possession, whereas your stack of plates doesn't count as one stack of plates. You'll likely be using only one plate at a time, with all other plates being for either guests or to supplement the stack of unwashed dishes in the sink. Be reasonable. 1. I used this today. Keep it. 2. I used this within the past week. Keep it. 3. I used this within the past month. Keep it. 4. I used this within the past 6 months. Get rid of it. 5. I used this within the past year. Get rid of it. 6. It has been more than a year since I used this. Get rid of it. 7. I did not even know I owned this. Get rid of it. If you draw a histogram to illustrate your number of possessions versus their usage, you might find that the number of things you use hourly is very low, increasing slightly for the things you use daily, and yet more for the things you use monthly, until you end up with a very large number of things used only once or less per year. Don't be surprised if you use fewer than 3% of your possessions daily and 90% or more of all possessions less than annually. This is a normal consumer pattern, but a waste of space and money. The goal is to bunch the histogram up on the opposite side, so that most possessions are used daily, with fewer possessions used weekly, only a few used monthly, and only a couple of keepsakes that rarely see any use. Usually one's possessions will then fit into 1 or 2 suitcases. To make the transition, anything that falls outside of this pattern should go into storage. In the U.S., people have so much stuff that one can rent commercial storage units. In other parts of the world, one has to come to some sort of arrangement with people who will rent out attic or shed space or store things for free. This process is most easily accomplished when relocating, and things have to come out of the closet, perhaps seeing daylight for the first time in a long time. Plan on relocating to a smaller home. While packing, sort things into moving boxes according to the list mentioned earlier. Put categories 1 through 3 into a few suitcases. If you need more than that, you're probably cheating. And put the rest in boxes headed to storage. Speaking of relocating to a smaller home, make sure to plan for things that are important to you. For instance, if you like to read, get a home close to the library. This way you can use the public library as your library rather than duplicating the books in your home. In fact, one of the strategies I've used is to check whether a book I own is available through the library. If it is, I sell it, swap it, or give it away. If going through this process while staying in the same home, one will find a lot of space liberated. This will make cleaning and maintenance easier. It might also make you question why you live in such a big house. It looks so empty. Please resist the temptation to fill the house with new stuff. A more lengthy process is to get rid of things slowly rather than putting them into storage. I don't think this is an optimal solution. Most likely the process will be too slow and will subsequently stall out of bitterness over the fact that things don't appear to change despite all efforts. The cost of moving slowly towards a goal is that one needs a long time to get anywhere. This requires more discipline and dedication. In other words, there is a trade-off between making sudden, large changes and being dedicated to incremental change. Only you will know which one fits you better. However, a slower process allows more maneuvering space. Rather than just putting things into storage, things can be thrown out, given away, exchanged, swapped, or sold. With the internet, this is much easier to facilitate. In my experience, the question of whether to give, trade, or sell depends on the value of the item. If the item has no use value whatsoever, it should probably be thrown out or recycled for parts. Fortunately, consumer society has a very good service level when it comes to throwing things out. In principle, you could throw everything in a dumpster. In fact, some people do this. Other people live off this bounty through dumpster diving. Giving away. If things have some use value but a price close to zero, such as old clothes, garden hoses, or a rusty but working bicycle, they can be given away. There are several systems for this depending on where you live. One can donate the things to thrift stores, charities, or religious institutions, which may be tax deductible. One can put them out on the sidewalk with a sign saying free. The method I like best, though, is free cycling. Free cycling is organized through an internet mailing list. People post things they have and things they want, and others respond. Once a connection has been made, the owner or donor simply puts the thing outside the front door and tells the recipient where to pick it up. When giving things away, consider city-to-city or even state-to-state arbitrage of goods between areas with high and low costs of living. It may be helpful to transport it to a cheaper place, which may be the next, smaller city. Here, the recipients may gratefully accept your $125 used chair, whereas in the expensive city, they may be dealing in $250 chairs and scoff at your $125 chair. Selling. If the value is higher, things can be sold. Everything I own is for sale, always. Ask me and I will give you a quote. Not only does this constantly remind me of the value of my possessions, but it prevents me from developing an attachment to the thing in question. A more enlightened state would be to always be willing to give away everything I own. Unfortunately, I'm not sufficiently skillful, nor do I as yet own so little to easily be able to reacquire and recreate everything I own, but that would be something to strive for. To sell things, I use online services exclusively. Online services like Craigslist are useful for common and generic items like furniture, garden tools, bicycles, toys, and so on. Listing is free, and the transaction is cash-based and hassle-free. For odd things that can be mailed, online auctions and marketplaces offer a wider audience. Many will offer a number of free listings each month, so take advantage of that. I usually pick a price point near the bottom to ensure a quick sale. Check back frequently to see if anyone is underpricing you. Serial ownership. Many things, books in particular come to mind, are sufficiently well built to last longer than you as their owner maintain an interest in them. Instead of storing them, which increases the demand for housing and new goods, I feel almost obligated to reduce this pressure by passing them along when I'm no longer interested, so that other people may enjoy them. For similar reasons, I also always attempt to buy things used. Not only does this keep the pressure off of people's homes, it also keeps the pressure off landfills, since normal people don't think twice about throwing perfectly functional items in the trash when their space becomes too crowded by stuff. In fact, any depreciating asset should always be bought used if you must own it at all. Serial ownership is one of the biggest contributions you can make towards counteracting environmental problems, such as climate change, resource depletion, and population pressure. As the resources required to build and transport stuff is generally higher than those used to repair and maintain stuff, and even the resources used to heat and light your home. Bartering and swapping. Bartering and swapping work best with what could be considered differentiated commodities, such as CDs, books, board games, computer games, and so on. These things are all different in degree but very similar in kind. A CD is a CD. And joining a network is a great way to get new media. Once you develop some skill in networking and bartering, you'll begin to pay attention to the needs of other people and whether you can fulfill them with the items you have. At this point, you may want to barter your excess items for food or services to reduce your stuff. Using up and wearing out. Those who take care of their stuff will likely be able to use their current inventory for several years before using it up. For instance, in my experience, one towel will last 4 years if it's the only one in use. Consequently, a set of 4 towels in rotation will last a good 16 years. Similarly, if t-shirts can be washed 100 times, are only worn once between washings, one is worn every day, and you have 15 of them, which shouldn't be a problem if you participate in a few events that give you a free t-shirt each year, you have enough t-shirts to last 4 years. Unlike cars and computers, which start failing all over once the first failures start to appear, clothes have known weak spots. For example, armpit, shoulder, and crotch seams, or heels and toes in socks. Learn to mend these. You can make a sport out of extending the wear. For instance, bed sheets generally wear out in the middle because the middle part covers the body. When it finally rips, this takes 3 to 4 years if you only have one set, and why own more? You can cut it in half along the middle and sew the sides together to become the new middle. This is how people used to do it. But I must admit that today fabric is so cheap that I'd just get a new set and turn the old sheets into rags for cleaning. The benefit of this exercise is perhaps not so much in extending the wear of things, but in learning what to look for when acquiring new things. For instance, having noticed that the no-stick treatment for pots and pans only lasts a couple of years, and that it can't, as far as I know, be replaced, get stainless steel, iron, or copper the next time. For shoes, get Norwegian welts, which allow a complete replacement of the sole. And try to avoid plastic. It is hard to fashion plastic replacement parts on your own. 6.1.4 How to Get Things. Things used to be built to last. It was expected that a piece of furniture or even a good jacket could be handed down to the next generation. With growing product quality, there was a limit to the size of the market. As soon as everybody had everything they needed, there was no one left to sell to, and businesses would have begun to shut down, leaving people with less work. This happened around the 1920s. The solution was, and still is, to change the focus to the service aspect. This can be a great idea when you don't want to own the thing, for example, toxic cleaners, cars, and so on. But it isn't great if you want feeless ownership. One contemporary example is when a $500 cell phone is sold for $1, but with a mandatory $1,000 contract. Leasing is another example. However, a more nefarious strategy has been to build products of an increasingly inferior quality, and in doing so, make them cheaper. This creates a continuous and dependable demand, as things break and are thrown out and replaced. It has therefore become somewhat of a challenge to find the good stuff. Finding the good stuff can be done by exploiting survivor bias. As someone informed me, the good stuff is whatever costs more than $100 in a pawn shop or an antique store. Free things. In general, people who live a life of abundance, like primitive tribesmen or Californians, will be happy to give things away, the latter primarily to create more space in their garages, and the former presumably because they can easily build replacements. Dumpster diving is one method of acquiring free things, but with the internet, the dumpster part is skipped. Post wanted or offered ads on mailing lists, news groups, or in classifieds, and people respond and come to pick it up. This saves the trouble of putting stuff in a dumpster and people from having to dive in to get it. It also saves stuff from the landfill. The range of stuff changing hands can be surprising, from leaves for composting to projector TVs. Supply and demand also fluctuates. What may be impossible to give away one month may be in high demand the next month. What may be impossible to give away in one place, entertainment centers in California, may be picked up in another within the hour, possibly to be used as firewood. Speaking of firewood, people are happy to give away rounds in the summer when they're clearing away old trees to increase the size of their lawns. Get a splitting maul and dry them for firewood in the winter. All it requires is a little planning and your heating is free. For lower-cost items which are not worth driving for, get rid of them by establishing a table. Put things on the table and mark them free. Lo and behold, people will quickly pick up on the idea, take your items away, and put other items down. This works for magazines, garden harvest, cookies, and so on, and is nicely established near the coffee machine, laundry facility, stairway, or other points where people gather or pass. Swapping and bartering. Another way of getting use value without paying money is by swapping. There are several options for online swapping, which gives one access to a much larger market. Some swapping works on a credit-based system. Rather than being paid money, giving away a book gets you a credit. Credits work like gift certificates, as they can be used to order books from other people. This avoids the friction of having to find a specific trading counterpart. Usually these services are offered for free, which also avoids the friction caused by commissions. Another solution is to trade directly. This comes with most of the problems of trade before the invention of money. Here one has to find another person and do the swap directly. One solution is three-way swaps. A gives to B, B gives to C, and C gives to A. Bartering and swapping can also be used to get rid of unwanted things. Using these methods, I have not paid for a CD or a DVD in years. Renting. Generally, renting is an overused method when it doesn't benefit the consumer, and an underused method when it would benefit the consumer. Consequently, if you're used to buying something, you should look into how and where to rent. Conversely, if you're used to renting, calculate whether it's worthwhile. When renting long-term, consider the cap rate, which holds for small items as well as houses. When renting, you're usually not responsible for breakdowns. This is a winning proposition if you don't have the skills to fix it yourself, and a losing one if you do have the skills or could cultivate them. Also important is how often you use a thing. Maybe a 24-foot ladder is only used once a year, in which case it could be rented from a home improvement store. If you do a lot of printing, it makes sense to own your own printer, but it actually takes a lot of 50-cent printouts at the local copy center before the price of a new printer is reached. Also, consider that instead of renting very expensive and rarely used special tools, you could simply hire a professional and his tools to do that part of the job. Borrowing. Borrowing is another method. The cardinal rule of borrowing is always to return the borrowed item in the same or better condition. There should be no exceptions to this rule. Returning something slightly damaged or dirty is almost guaranteed to cut you out of the loop the next time you want to borrow something. Lending your things out can also be a way of having access to them without having to store them. Now, you may think that giving your books to the library will allow you to borrow them back and not have to store them constantly. However, libraries will most likely sell your books instead to cover their operating costs. Sharing ownership. Many offices have a coffee club where money is contributed to buying a shared coffee machine and coffee supplies. This saves everybody the expense of each buying their own individual coffee machine. It takes initiative to establish such clubs, so don't wait for someone else to do it. If you have an idea, propose it. People just might say yes. Here are some examples of things that can be purchased and shared. Tools, sports equipment, AV equipment, computer equipment, vehicles, boats, appliances, and so on. It seems to be a fact of life that very few people will take the initiative to establish something new, but many will gladly go along once someone proposes it. Here are some examples of people to start a club with: friends, family, co-workers, and team members. Such clubs can also be established with things everybody already owns. I have heard of households rotating kitchen appliances, using the theory that ice cream makers, waffle irons, grills, and similar rarely used appliances might not see daily use. That way, everybody gets a chance to try them out. I find that these arrangements work best when everybody trusts one another. Living behind the cutting edge. In computing, actually high-tech in general, there are a number of consumers who effectively pay to be beta testers of companies' products in exchange for having the latest and greatest. Leave it to other consumers to work out the technological kinks and take the depreciation hit for driving it off the lot. If you really enjoy being at the cutting edge, be a reviewer, a tester, or even a developer. Similarly, there are a great number of people who must watch movies as soon as they come out or pay full price for CDs. Instead, lag the edge and watch movies at the dollar theater or wait for them to be released on DVD. Even better, wait until they appear in the library or on TV. You'll see new movies at the latter sources as well. That is, they'll be new to you, and the only difference will be in lagging the movie theaters by 1 to 2 years. But you'll no longer be paying attention to that. Most curious is the phenomenon of the hyperconsumer, who effectively pays to continuously own new stuff to avoid being seen sitting on last year's furniture, and the culture that goes along with that. The hyperconsumer has to get rid of last year's stuff somehow, which can be had at X depreciation costs for much less. This also goes for store inventory that did not sell in time. Last year's model has to be discounted even though it's effectively the same as the current one, because who would want to buy last year's model at the same price? If I have to get something new, like roller skates, I just get last year's model. Last year's inventory is typically cleared at certain times of the year, so keep an eye out and be ready to pick it up. It goes fast. The Limit Order Price Book. Oftentimes, decisions are based on emotions, but until or unless you develop a sense of pleasure from not spending too much money, or a sense of dread from parting with excessive money, or getting anything worse than the best price, emotions are not the best decision instrument. For grocery shopping and other regular purchases, use a maximum price ceiling, which is the lowest price you have ever seen. Only buy at that point. If memory doesn't serve well, use a notebook. It's easier to memorize a limited number of items commonly purchased. This method is very powerful, and if followed, will always result in buying things only on sale. I use it to guide what's for dinner, whatever's on sale. If you feel really motivated, plot prices on a weekly or monthly basis. This should prove quite revealing. Many things, from vegetables to clothing, vary consistently in price on an annual cycle. Follow this cycle. 6.1.5 How to Make Things. When I ask people who fix their own cars or motorcycles how they learned where all the bits and parts go, I never get the answer I expect. Apparently, they didn't take an evening class or community college course. They were not even taught by their dad. Rather, they got an engine that didn't work, then just tinkered intelligently with it until it did. In fact, it seems that a majority of people taking classes are just looking to get credentials for skills they already possess. Thus, the biggest barrier to overcome is the perception that you need to be an expert or take classes in order to be able to make things. This is particularly problematic for white-collar workers with white-collar hobbies, like computing, or no-collar hobbies like watching TV. However, if you can tie a bow tie, you can easily learn to knit. I learned knitting from a web page. If you can print your name, you can learn how to solder. I learned it when I was 8 years old, and make electronic gadgets or repair electric gadgets. Repairing broken electronics is much more difficult, which is a good reason to avoid electronic controls on most electromechanical devices. If you can draw a straight line and follow instructions, you can build your own furniture. If you can put the cap back on a bottle, you can fix engines and mechanical items, as those are generally composed of fasteners and parts. Lest I give the impression that the skilled trades are really that easy, however, let me say that they're easy in principle, but quickly discovering what the problem is requires a large collection of tacit knowledge. Without this knowledge, the apprentice will have to try a lot of possible solutions before hitting on the right one. In other words, the expert will be able to do the same job much faster, but the apprentice will actually be able to do the job about as well, it will just take much longer. Most things can be created or repaired with a combination of the right tools and parts. The challenge thus becomes one of sourcing tools and parts. Ease of sourcing is important. You don't want to own anything with proprietary parts. Fortunately, there are plenty of good websites and books, sometimes you have to ask for the shop manuals, which will tell you exactly which tools and parts you need to accomplish a given task, down to the catalog number. Find these books by reading book reviews online. I suggest starting with either simple repairs or simple construction projects and build a tool base as needs develop. It may behoove you to keep a list of receipts and expenses to deduct should you later decide to turn it into a business. Buying a set of, say, screwdrivers to save money is rarely worthwhile. You will end up breaking the ones you use constantly and with the collection of ones you never use. Never buy the set. Also, avoid buying a fully equipped shop set for the same reasons. I recommend getting quality tools but doing cheap projects using cheap materials in the beginning. Quality has at least two components. First, tools are mostly an extension of the tool user. It wouldn't make sense to spend more money to get functions that the user can't fully utilize. Second, the inherent quality of the tool, as categorized into 3 tiers: basic or economic, standard, and shop or professional. These labels are typically not indicative of their place of use. Consider, for example, pedal wrenches, which are used to remove a pedal from the crank arm of a bicycle. A basic wrench is a short, stamped piece of hardened metal which is sold for occasional use. However, unless the pedal is new or the threads are covered with anti-seize, it will bind, and the metal wrench will cut into your hand, and most likely you won't be able to remove the pedal. It would be more accurate to say that the basic wrench is for light-duty use. Conversely, the shop wrench is longer, angled for leverage, easy on the hands, and accepts an extension bar, a piece of pipe used for leverage. The shop wrench will take off anything, even if you rarely use it. There is nothing more frustrating than an inadequate tool. Unfortunately, it's hard to know in advance which strength of tool is required. Never buy the biggest tool just to be sure. Specifically, if you already have a light-duty tool which has proven sufficient so far, don't upgrade it for the sake of upgrading. Making things is a synthetic, creative process which is based on first mastering the technical skills, second on mastering the design principles. There are two paths to enlightenment. On the first path, one first learns all the technical skills before moving on to the design phase. This can be done by starting out in service and repair before moving on to rebuilds and finally builds. On the second path, one starts out with a building project which usually comes with parts and a plan and learns the skills on an as-needed basis. The former seems tailored to an educational, work, or small business structure. The latter seems more tailored to the hobbyist. The money flow from the former could quickly turn positive. The money flow from the latter will stay negative for longer, as the aim and required level of mastery for profit in creative design is higher than in service and repair. Skills that are likely worthwhile include woodworking, electrical work, such as wiring, soldering, and etching printboards, engine work, vehicle maintenance, cooking, preserving, clothes repair, such as mending and hand or machine sewing, and house maintenance or handyman work. Reusing. Build things out of your environment. Find out what kind of utility something provides. Everybody is familiar with the college student bookshelf made out of a few boards and concrete blocks. You can build a bed frame out of wood pallets, or you can build a table out of a large phone cable drum. You can get food containers from store-bought products. Lunch meat is sometimes sold in reusable plastic containers. Mustard is sold in drinking cups. Use a permanent marker to draw lines and it becomes a measuring cup. Olives are sold in what could be spice containers. A fork is a whisk. A plate is a cutting board with the right knife, a serrated tomato or utility knife. You can make clothes hangers out of cardboard boxes. You can store clothes on hangers or in suitcases or trunks. A nice trunk is a table. Laundry goes in big plastic bags. A towel or clothes in a pillowcase or t-shirt becomes a pillow. A zipped sleeping bag is a hay box for your pressure cooker. An unzipped sleeping bag becomes a duvet. The liner becomes a blanket. The best way to think up new inventive ideas is to imagine being on a desert island with no other option than to create a solution out of the materials at hand. This requires conquering the tendency to go out and buy the known commercial solution, but with time, it can be overcome. The fixer-upper, or holding. Most consumables and many capital assets suffer depreciation and lose resale value year after year. High-quality items, particularly if they involve old technology that has become canonical, that is, it can't be improved, don't lose value and may even gain value, effectively functioning as an inflation hedge. Some examples include revolvers, but not pistols, woodworking and machining tools, mechanical watches, tube amplifiers, wool coats, knives, and fishing reels. For example, a new high-quality tenon saw may cost $145. Since there is little difference functionally between a new high-quality saw and an old high-quality saw, the used price may be $130. All things being equal, the price after several years will still be $130. If you manage to fix it up, for instance by refurbishing the handle or sharpening the blade, it may fetch more. If you got some rust spots on it, it may lose value. Subtracting the purchasing price from the sales price should come to a small amount. It's interesting to note that this amount is comparable to or smaller than the price of a cheap new $20 saw, which will only fetch $1 if you sell it. This is also more environmentally and financially sustainable. Sustainability comes from lifetime ownership, not necessarily by the same person, of one quality item instead of 10 disposable items. Doing some research and plotting prices as a function of product age creates a depreciation scatter plot. For each year, there will be a range of prices reflecting the different conditions. If the curve is trending downwards, the fixer-upper strategy is to buy something in poor condition, fix it up, and sell it later. This will make the holding cost zero. This way you can own expensive items like boats or cars for almost no cost. In terms of financial considerations, the money which is now sitting in an asset that is unproductive has opportunity costs. If your rate of return is 6%, a $50,000 boat would cost you $3,000 annually, which you could have made had the money been invested. On the other hand, perhaps you are holding cash at 0.5%. In this case, your cost is only $250. If you offer the boat for chartering, you may even make money. 6.2. Shelter. Many houses increasingly serve not only as living quarters, but also as storage areas for toy collections, personal libraries, galleries of art, and other assorted knickknacks, small supermarkets, due to the massive refrigerators, home cinemas, and restaurant-sized kitchens, which seem proportional in size to the time the owners spend away from them eating out. Outsource the storage and live in something smaller. Additionally, there's a preference for suburban housing that leaves people far away from their jobs, unable to get anywhere without owning a car. Getting a driver's license and a car at 16 is a rite of passage into the freedom of adulthood. Without access to public transportation, which makes little sense when everything is spread out, it's difficult to get around without a car. Consequently, people growing up in these places often don't know how to ride a bike. Many can't even walk greater distances than a driveway, lacking the stamina, the proper clothing, and perhaps even the faith that they can engage in the vigorous labor of walking 3 miles without consulting a physician first. Houses are surrounded by asphalt, unproductive vegetation, and artificial lakes which cover valuable agricultural soil. The unproductive vegetation is specifically selected to be unproductive to avoid having to pick up fruit from the ground. Why get free fruit from the garden when you can pay for it at the supermarket 5 to 10 miles away? In addition, the vegetation is often non-native, which requires significant amounts of intervention. Consider, for example, how lawns are first fertilized and watered, then once they grow accordingly, they are cut down. The houses are poorly built, but made to look expensive with fake brick walls and concrete columns. The optimal design for an efficient house is almost always rectangular with as few corners as possible, as corners are structurally weak and admit cold. Speaking of cold, housing is typically poorly insulated, if at all. This is a viable strategy in a world of cheap energy, a world that may not last much longer with its central heating and cooling. With cold or warm walls, the air temperature has to be raised above or lowered below normal to compensate for the radiative heat loss or gain from the walls. As a consequence, as money spent on insulation has gone down, room temperature in the winter and summer has gone up and down respectively, and the cost of living has gone up. The problem is that there's a cultural perception of what constitutes a good house, and despite, or perhaps due to, all the failures mentioned earlier, the suburban house with a lawn, a picket fence, and a car or 3, one for each person over legal driving age, parked in the driveway, is the pinnacle to attain. Like a peacock's tail, and in general for status symbols, the more non-productive and inefficient they are, the better status symbols they make. After all, if someone can afford to use a lot of resources in non- or even counterproductive ways, he must be rich, powerful, and strong. As the suburban house is able to absorb tremendous amounts of money, it makes an excellent status symbol. Considering that the median home is priced above $150,000, a mortgage rate of 5% will cost the homeowner $9,663 each year, which is more than the entire budget of the lifestyle described in this chapter. Now add on insurance, because nobody is going to lend money on an uninsured house, taxes, possible home association fees, and general maintenance, and that's another 50% on top of the mortgage payments. This comprises a huge opportunity cost in foregone investment returns, which will be non-existent. Any retirement accounts will be cordoned off, and therefore, having no assets to speak of and no investment cash flow, the homeowner will be forced to pay for his house with wage income over the duration of the mortgage. Renting such a home is obviously not much wiser. Except during extreme bubbles, renting costs approximately the same as owning, since the owner passes along the costs. Either buying or renting a home that is priced at several times your annual income is a huge financial mistake. No business, not any that lives long, would obtain long-term debt that exceeds 50% of their equity and spend it all on non-productive overhead. Yet homeowners consider debts exceeding their non-productive equity by 400% conservative. Hence, a trophy house, or a trophy anything for that matter, is not very compatible with financial independence. Giving up the trophy house in exchange for financial independence can result in alienation from those who are heavily socialized to middle-class status symbols. However, there are significant subcultures in which you can easily find friends and partners who put less importance on curb appeal and one-hour commutes. Therefore, there is a deliberate choice to make between financial independence and the standard house engineered to give the appearance of enhanced socioeconomic status. You can have one or the other, but not both. In other words, living in something significantly more economically efficient, smaller, and more conveniently located than what your peers are living in is key to financial independence. For most people, a home is basically only a place to sleep, eat, shower, and keep stuff. Realize that you could choose between having an extra bedroom and having an extra $200 per month. It's quite possible that the marginal utility of $200 is higher elsewhere in the budget. To become financially independent of a $200 per month expense requires investments between $60,000 and $80,000. This is the so-called latte effect on a large scale, except that instead of a daily superfluous cup of luxury coffee, we're talking about a superfluous bed or bathroom that is rarely used. How many years will it take you to save this much more money? I think that a good guideline per person for living arrangements is $200 to $350 per month per person, or about 10 to 15% of your net salary. If anyone tries to convince you to spend more, they're trying to sell you into a lifetime of wage work. In some places, this buys more than in other places. As far as I'm concerned, the percentage is absolute. If I want to live in a nicer place, it simply translates into a smaller place. For instance, in New York or San Francisco, this just about gets you a room in an apartment shared with 4 others. In other parts of the country, this figure will buy you an entire house. When I started out in grad school, I was paying about $275 each month for a small room with a sink. I shared the kitchen, toilets, and showers with 18 other people. This was close to the downtown area of one of the most expensive cities in the world. When I relocated for work, I moved into my very own apartment for $400 per month. Then I moved into a house together with my future wife for $330 per person each month. We then made the mistake of moving into a house at $700 per person each month. That lasted a year with stagnating savings as a result. We currently spend $237 per person each month. The idea is therefore to seriously consider whether your current living arrangements are optimally aligned with your liberty and pursuit of happiness. Is your money best spent on an extra bedroom or 5 years of freedom? If not aligned, doing so should be of primary importance. Unless you revel in interior decorating, and if so, why not decorate other people's homes and get paid for it? Home maintenance and repair or cleaning, most activities don't require a large home. Resources like money and time spent earning money may therefore be better spent on activities you enjoy, rather than things you possess. Even if you like entertaining, you could simply rent a restaurant the few times a month or year that you do. If you do it more often, open a bed and breakfast, or consider expanding the realm of entertainment beyond eating. 6.2.1 Sleeping and Other Living Arrangements. The Taxman defines a home as a place to sleep and a place to cook, with bathroom facilities. This leaves wide room for interpretation. For example, a motorhome or a boat is a home under those conditions, and thus interest on a loan for such would be tax-deductible. But what's important is not the rooms, but the utility that must be acquired. Instead of thinking in nouns like bedroom, kitchen, and bathroom, think in verbs like sleeping, eating, and washing. Make a list of activities or verbs that you need to do, such as sleeping, eating, and washing up, and that you want to do, such as writing, hiking, cycling, entertaining, working, skating, talking, cooking, playing, exercising, and so on. Now consider whether you do some of these activities often enough to have in-home facilities, or whether you're better off outsourcing them. Consider your list of items and how often you use them, and extend it to your general facilities. For example, how long since you last used the guest room, the bar room, or the home cinema room? Consider that some rooms could have multiple uses. In particular, are the facilities available nearby already? In this case, there's really no reason to duplicate them at home. For instance, if you're a gym rat and spend 6 days a week at the gym, maybe you can shower there and thus don't need elaborate bathroom facilities at home. If you eat in cafeterias most of the time, maybe you don't need anything fancier than a microwave and a mini refrigerator for your in-home kitchen facilities. Hence, if you currently have rooms and facilities that mostly go unused or could go unused with a change of habit or hobby to something that requires less stuff on location, yet provides as much enjoyment, don't include them in your next home. Living. A place to sleep can be provided by couch surfing, a ship berth, a tube hotel, a military cot, a tent, airports for the perma-travelers, a houseboat, a yacht, a yurt, a car, a van, a motorhome, a truck, or a room. Some jobs, like long-haul trucking, serving in the military, caretaking, house-sitting, and commercial fishing, include some form of shelter. Note that some of these choices lend themselves more to renting than others. For instance, it's hard to buy a room in a house, yet it's usually possible to rent one. Conversely, it's easier to buy a yacht than to rent one as a liveaboard. You should choose your living arrangements to be somewhat compatible with your interests. If you like other people, go for the shared living, dorms, or communes. Do you like the sea? Go for the boats. How about the road? Do you like to feel like you're getting away with something? Check out stealth, van, or city camping. Some chain stores will allow overnight parking. Some national parks allow longer stays, all for free. Are you handy? Consider owning something older or building your own. Are you responsible? Consider caretaking. Do you want minimum hassle? How about renting a furnished room from a landlord? Do you want maximum hassle? Buy an apartment complex, live in one of the units, and rent out the additional units. Searching the internet for any of these terms should lead to people interested in one or another way of living. They do exist. Don't think that the only way to live is in a house in suburbia or an apartment in the city. Eating. The need for a kitchen and its particular configuration is determined by diet. Even the need for particular kitchen appliances is determined by diet. Eating a mostly or exclusively raw diet eliminates the range oven and replaces it with a blender and a juicer. The need for a refrigerator is determined by your location. If you live close to a supermarket, you can simply store your food at the market rather than in your refrigerator. On the other hand, the more inconvenient your location is, the larger the refrigerator you need. In other words, if you were a serious health nut, you could completely replace your kitchen with a blender. If you desire some variation, simply eat somewhere else once in a while. If you desire some warm food for a change, bring out the camping stove. There's no need to own a range unless you use it every day. You may even be lucky enough that your company offers a lunch buffet. Make lunch your main meal and have a sandwich for dinner. No kitchen needed. Hygiene. With a little planning and consideration, all families will do just fine with one bathroom. Multiple bathrooms only make sense if you're housing an entire football team for some reason. Unless you fancy playing with composting toilets, human manure, and building your own thunderbox, toilets all work the same. Showering may very well be accomplished off-site, for example, in a gym. A blog reader informed me that he used an off-site toilet for half a year, walking 1.5 miles each way. Showers can range from a bucket over a solar shower to more elaborate arrangements. Also, there's no rule that says showering must happen in the morning right after getting out of bed. Living with other people. Minimal use of certain facilities calls for their sharing with other people. The easiest way to share is to live with others, or at least next to them. Recently, the trend has been the exact opposite, with more and more people living by themselves and building rooms that provide utility just for them, like home theaters, rec rooms, bars, and so on. Sharing things, as in dorms, communes, or families, represents enormous savings. If you're a student, it's tempting to move from home, as I did, but there are many savings to be had by staying at home, both for you and your parents. You will also reduce the work associated with cooking, laundry, and so on. Consider that resources are being wasted whenever an asset is lying dormant. Spending 8 to 10 hours out of the home, 8 hours sleeping, and a few hours doing other leaves very few hours for using the home. As such, spending a lot of money on one's home makes little sense, since one's effective place of being is actually one's job or office. The fewer the users of a given room, the more resources are wasted. Some rooms in many homes are used very rarely, such as the bathroom and the kitchen, both rooms on which it has become popular to spend a lot of money, ironically. Other rooms, like the dining room or sitting room, are practically never used. This leaves the bedroom. When sharing, one has to avoid queuing problems. If you live in a place where everybody needs to leave at 7 in the morning and wants to get up at the same time, you have a queuing problem. This is typically solved by having multiple bathrooms. This ridiculous waste can be solved by a slight change of habit. For example, someone gets up half an hour earlier, or simply by living with people who have different habits. When I was a grad student, I lived in a dorm. More accurately, as I spent most of my waking hours in my office, I realized that I effectively lived in my office. The dorm room I had was just a place where I slept. I'd sleep about 7 to 9 hours a day, which effectively meant my bed had a duty cycle of 33%, which is probably what most bedrooms see, except a berth on a small ship, which may see 66% or even 100% use, as one person can sleep while the other is on watch. I cooked once every 6 days. I did all my own cooking and ate in my room. Cooking took 30 minutes a week. Therefore, if I had had my own kitchen, my duty cycle would have been 0.5 divided by the product of 6 times 24, which equals 0.347%. A waste of resources. It therefore made sense to share the kitchen with others. 18 others. I avoided the crowds due to my work schedule. I'm at my most creative during evenings and nights when there are few distractions. Hence, I would cook and do laundry at 2 in the morning. Showers and toilets were also shared and professionally cleaned daily. This also makes sense. After all, how much time do you spend in the bathroom? For my schedule and priorities, my living arrangements, 10 minutes away from my office, were fully optimized with very little waste. Many consider living with other people a horrible idea. I suspect this is due to atrophied social skills from living apart in houses, and lately in rooms. Perhaps a criterion for moving in with anyone, for instance your spouse or a friend, should be sufficient social skills to be able to tolerate being together in small quarters. Learn to be easy to get along with. Be considerate. I'm sure this is a learned skill. Historically, extended families have lived together just fine, and perhaps living under the same roof as Uncle Bob or sharing a house with another family will become the norm once again. Living together with others provides significant economies of scale, with the largest effect realized by adding the first person. The fewer people there are in a household and the more aligned their interests are, the fewer the compromises that have to be made. Therefore, depending on alignment, there's an optimal number of people in a household. If you can't share rooms with others or living in solitude is very important to you, you need to reduce your expenses in other ways, by finding something smaller or relocating to another town. Rent or own. Like doing IPOs and buying and selling stocks on Wall Street, there is much money to be made in building and in transaction costs from buying and selling houses. There are significant pressures, political and economic, to get people involved in this game, including the strange idea of including the value of one's home in one's net worth, or having taxpayers pay part of your interest while you pay the other part to the bank. This begets the crazy idea of a starter home, and the even crazier idea of buying something bigger as income increases. This, in turn, has led to speculating in one's domicile, using arguments like, real estate always goes up, better buy before the market runs away. After the recent crash, I don't think I need to refute that anymore. If you're using a mortgage because houses always appreciate in value, you're simply speculating in leveraged real estate, something which is surprisingly unregulated compared to speculating in stocks on the margin, which uses the same principle. In the long run, real estate goes up at the same rate as inflation, which is to be expected for a practically risk-free, non-productive asset. It's not a good idea to consider the house you live in as an investment unless you know more about real estate than the average person, and in particular, enough to speculate on its direction. Including home value in one's net worth is an academic exercise, as this part of net worth is irrelevant to financial independence. What matters is cash flow, and it's well known that any cash flow from your home is negative. The only question then is whether it's more negative than renting something similar. You can calculate whether this is the case by considering the net asset value, NAV, which entails multiplying your annual rental income by the difference of 1 minus the upkeep ratio, and then dividing that amount by the sum of the risk-free rate and the risk premium. Here, the upkeep ratio is typically 30 to 40% of the rental income. The risk-free rate is the going rate of 30-year bonds. The risk premium is typically 1 to 2%. You can also calculate the capitalization rate, or cap rate, if you multiply your annual rental income by the difference of 1 minus the upkeep ratio and then divide that amount by the price. The cap rate should be a few percent over the risk-free rate to adjust for the possibility of the house burning down. As you can see, it's essentially the same calculation. You should understand these calculations and be able to modify them to your situation. In terms of rent, landlords attempt to pass on mortgage, maintenance, and insurance costs to the renter. However, they can't charge more than what the rental market will bear. If you're renting and equivalent housing is selling at its NAV, the landlord is successfully passing all maintenance, insurance, and mortgage costs onto you. In this case, you'll probably be better off owning, since you should be able to maintain your home for less than what you're paying your landlord to pay for caretakers. If it's selling above NAV, you'll be better off renting. If it's selling below NAV, you'll be better off buying unless you know you're going to move within the next few years. 6.2.2 How to Find Shelter. The three most important things that matter for shelter are 1. Location relative to your work, 2. Location relative to your grocery outlet, and 3. Cost. If you work from home, it's the location relative to your customers that matters. If you don't need to go to your customers physically, this doesn't matter at all. If you can grow most of your own food, location relative to your food supply doesn't matter either. You may want to consider getting food shipped. Run the calculation. And of course, if you're loaded, you don't need to worry about cost. But then why are you listening to this chapter? For now, let's assume that all three are important, as they would be for most people. For renting, the method I use is to go to Craigslist and click on Housing. Then I put in my limits, $200 minimum, because that removes a lot of useless search results, and $350 maximum. If you're two people with an income, you could put $400 to $700. It's likely that for certain areas, houses or apartments are simply out of range. In this case, consider co-housing or roommates. In particular, consider radical alternatives. We currently live in a motorhome, for example. In addition, some of the cheaper places may not be heavily advertised. We lived in the same place for 2 years before discovering an option that was $400 per month instead of $660 per month. Ask around. If you're priced out of the market, you should consider other areas. I wouldn't be too tied to a particular city. Indeed, a frequent excuse is that I need to live here. Actually, unless you can document some critical need, for example, a medical reason for a particular climate, you only want to live in a particular place. This want, then, comes down to paying extra versus your other goals. The search should result in several potential addresses. Next, find routes to work and groceries, respectively. Get a map and some tacks. Mark your work address and the potential housing addresses and trace out connecting routes. Then calculate the distances. There are online tools that make this easy. I highly recommend not owning a car, since transportation will most likely be your second largest expense. Therefore, check to see if those streets are walkable or bikeable, no disappearing sidewalks, killer intersections, or killer people. Online, you can use satellite views of the map at maximum resolution to scan for sidewalks. Unfortunately, this requirement sometimes results in detours that can turn a 3-mile route into a 4-mile one. Also, get a map of bus stops or other public transportation. Buses will extend your range. If you live 1 mile from a bus stop and your work is 1 mile from another bus stop, your effective distance is 2 miles. Also, check options for carpooling. If you live in a region with heavy winters, you may want to walk rather than ride a bike due to the time it takes to wipe the bike down after each trip. In that case, limit your maximum distance to 3 miles, which will take about an hour to walk. If you have a bike option, I would say 7 miles tops. However, perhaps you're tougher than I am. Some bike commuters ride more than 15 miles each way every day. Walking a 6-mile round trip daily is certainly doable. I did it daily for half a year once, but I wouldn't want to walk much farther than that. It simply takes too much time. Some may be presently bound by mortgages that are underwater. Don't fall for the sunk cost fallacy. Or by not having sufficient ready funds to make a deposit, in which case they may resort to just reconsidering or postponing the move. Even if you're not going to move, try going through the exercise anyway, just to realize that it's possible. Don't worry, there are other ways to self-actualize and gain self-respect than living in expensive housing. Furthermore, in most vocations, you'll rarely be keeping up appearances with anyone other than your neighbors. Your employer and clients will most likely not even know where you live, and your real friends won't care. 6.2.3 Telecommuting and Work. Moving your work to your home eliminates transportation to work and removes the constraint of living close to work. It's likely that it also removes other constraints, such as corporate hours and dress code, as well as inconvenient constraints such as not being able to drop work at a moment's notice if something else comes up. I prefer supplying products or services that can be sold locally by mail or online, as this makes it easier to find customers. Furthermore, if you work in a field with a high return on assets, that is, your income is large relative to your investments in fixed assets, your fixed assets will be easy to move, or you make so much money that moving expenses are of no concern to you. Computer jobs only require a computer, which is easily portable. Also consider watch repair, micromechanics, microelectronics, accounting, tax assistance, and other jobs that don't require heavy machinery. Instead of moving the work home to your shelter, also consider moving your shelter to where the work is. Contractors live in travel trailers that they pull around the country, living at low rents close to wherever the work is, and they use their work trucks to pull the trailer. 6.2.4 Domestic Food Supply. There are 3 ways to supply your food domestically without having to leave home. The first method is to order in, either having ready-made food delivered to your door, which is expensive, or groceries delivered, also expensive, but maybe not as expensive as a car. The second method is to buy in bulk. Shop for groceries once a month. This will be similar to provisioning for a cruising boat, and books on cruising will offer detailed instructions for how to do this, even without the need for refrigeration. Alternatively, survival literature will provide plans for even longer food storage. The benefit of this method is that should something happen, you'll likely have food for a few or even several weeks, depending on your buffer. If you want this kind of coverage, don't forget to store water. Mark everything with the buy date, eat the oldest first, and keep the store in rotation. The third method is growing a majority of your own food. Being completely self-sufficient is economically inefficient. It would make economic sense to focus on crops that are expensive, such as tomatoes, and buy crops that are cheap, such as potatoes. Combining plants with animals that will eat whatever humans don't eat and provide fertilizer that humans don't provide either will cap the waste. Unfortunately, zoning laws prohibit such farming in most urban settings. However, there's a growing trend of urban farmers that push these laws to the limit under a don't ask, don't tell policy. For instance, you could keep rabbits, for meat, in your basement and know they won't smell if you clean the pens. If you can keep animals above ground, have your chicken eat some of the red wiggler worms you use for speedy composting of your green waste. If you can't have a chicken, at least get a fishing license and use your surplus worms or share them with others. There are always people who are into vermicomposting. All it takes to build a vermicomposter are 2 buckets and a drill. If you can't get access to land and indoor hydroponics is too far-fetched, you could join a community-supported agriculture, CSA. Buying into a CSA seems rather expensive, though, and it may be cheaper to arrange your own community by asking friends if you can use some of their unused land to plant something. Many will be happy to let you pluck their oranges or apples to keep their lawn free of obstacles. Some engage in guerrilla gardening. You can find many books describing how to grow your own food, whether it's on a farm, a small homestead, or even your balcony. In my opinion, at present price levels, growing your own food isn't going to save you much, if any, money. At future price levels, it most likely will. Furthermore, having insourced some of your own food supply, you'll be more resilient. Besides, gardening can be a very satisfying pastime, as you literally get to eat the fruits of your labor, something which is rarely the case in a real job. 6.2.5 Lights and Electric. First, quit the wasteful habit of leaving the lights on everywhere. Leaving a room for more than 1 minute means turning the lights off. In particular, it means turning off minor appliances like TVs, radios, and computers. If no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Yes, it does. Next, reconsider whether the amount of lighting is appropriate. I've seen close to 800 watts being used to light a living room, which is clearly unnecessary. Replace the 100-watt light bulbs in big chandeliers with smaller light bulbs. Some well-designed lamps are much better at diffusing the light and directing it downwards. In general, move the light source close to where it is needed. These measures will help more than switching the house to CFLs and keeping your bad habits. Extreme measures involve making sure that your devices are truly switched off. Many modern off switches just put the device in standby mode. If you're handy with a soldering iron and understand electronics, you can install your own off switch at the DC side of the power supply, or you can simply pull the plug out. I wouldn't recommend going out and buying energy-efficient appliances without doing a detailed analysis of current cost of electricity versus future cost of electricity, plus cost of appliance. It's quite likely that it won't be worthwhile. If appliances are to be replaced, the absolute power consumption is more important than the relative consumption. By changing your eating habits from refrigerated and frozen food to a diet of fresh food and staples, you'll be able to get away with a much smaller refrigerator. I can keep my leftovers in a dorm-sized refrigerator. When I have lived in places with larger refrigerators, they have always been mostly empty. Save a few bucks by filling them with water containers instead. Large refrigerators are mainly filled with condiments and compost. That is, a large assortment of ketchup, mayonnaise, hot sauce, and stuff you're not going to eat anyway. Keep in mind that people have been conditioned to store everything in refrigerators, even things that don't really need cooling. Reading sailing and cruising manuals can be very helpful if you plan to store food for weeks on end. I find it easier just to live close to a supermarket and drop in when I'm out. With that in mind, you may decide to go refrigeratorless. You wouldn't be the first. You'll likely be amazed at how silent your home will be without the droning compressor. While a refrigerator is a suboptimal strategy, a large chest freezer may be a worthwhile investment. The reason is that you can stock up on sales. Again, though, if you let your meals be dictated by sales, you can forego the freezer. In terms of appliances, consider whether electric is appropriate. Unless you use the gadget more than 1 hour per week, it most likely is not. With a little research, it's often possible to find a manual version. Hand drills, grinders, mortar and pestle, wheat grinders, and so on. In short, most household tools come in some pre-electric version. This primitive version is often better built and will last a lifetime. That is your lifetime, not the lifetime of the product, a warranty that never made any sense to me. Be prepared for sticker shock, though. This kind of quality has a large upfront cost. A synergistic side effect of the manual version is that it requires human power, which burns calories, generates heat, and provides a closer connection to the work. Indeed, kneading dough can be done with the hands. It doesn't require a stand mixer unless you're baking twice a day. 6.2.6 Heating and Cooling. The central heating, which everybody in the Western world takes for granted, is a strange concept to other cultures. Central heating has conditioned us to fairly tight tolerance ranges. However, it's possible to change your body to feeling quite comfortable while sitting in a t-shirt at 15 degrees Celsius, 59 degrees Fahrenheit, or alternatively deal with 30 degrees Celsius, 86 degrees Fahrenheit. How warm or cold you feel depends on metabolism, circulation, diet, activity, clothing, and environment. If you've ever relocated from a cold climate to a warm climate, you've probably been surprised at how quickly you adapt. What used to be a balmy 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, outside is now freezing cold. Feeling warm or cold has a lot to do with adaptation. Unfortunately, it's now normal to live in heated and air-conditioned bubbles, which allow for no adaptation at all, except perhaps to the price of those services. Here's how to do it. To adapt to heat, you need to increase the efficacy of your sweat glands. This is best done by exercising or being physically active at high temperature, like outside without air conditioning. With increased heat, you won't need to eat to stay warm like you would in a colder environment, and thus you'll eat less, eat lighter foods, more vegetables. This will save money and you'll also be eating in season. Change your schedule to do more physical work early in the morning and take a siesta during the warmest hours of the day. Sleep outside, or at least with open windows. These changes are possible once you achieve control over your work schedule. To adapt to cold, try switching to cold showers. Instead of standing under the shower head, move it around the body, starting with the head and extremities. This will save on water and heat, and it will increase cold tolerance and circulation. It takes about 2 weeks to adapt. Any kind of cheating can be treated as a setback. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. Another way to feel warmer, but actually be cooler, is to lose subcutaneous fat under the skin. This brings the surface of the skin closer to the heat-generating sources, muscles and organs, within the body. As a consequence, your skin will feel warmer to the touch. Since heat loss increases with surface to volume area, the rounder and larger the body, the less loss, which is why children and long, slender adults lose more heat. This will require more heat to be generated, and consequently, you'll need to be more physically active and eat more. Food increases metabolism. Warm food with a high heat capacity or large water content, such as soup, comes with thermal energy, or heat, as well. The body will naturally want to eat more when the environment is cold because the metabolism is naturally increased, and vice versa when it's warm. As a corollary, if you're on reduced calories relative to the ambient temperature, you'll feel colder. Not adjusting one's eating to the season will lead to difficulties when trying to cope with warm weather without air conditioning or cold weather without heating. An intensive exercise regime, that is, heavy weightlifting or similar, substantially increases the metabolism up to 24 hours afterwards. Low-intensity exercising like running, cycling, dancing, or yoga doesn't have a similar effect. Here, the body reverts to normal within an hour. One solution is to keep moving, also useful when outdoors, in which case if you're cold, move faster. Perform basic activities that require some human muscle power instead of sitting or standing still and pushing buttons. For example, use manual appliances. Take up hobbies and crafts with a manual component. If you spend your evenings doing carpentry or baking, real baking, not powder mixing, it's unlikely that you'll be cold even if the central heating is off. With all this talk of generating heat, it may be interesting to know that a seated person emits around 100 watts, and a sleeping person around 80 watts. This number is higher for someone who has exercised intensely within the past 24 hours. 100 watts is not much, but it's interesting to consider that if you fill a room with people, they'll heat it up. High-intensity workouts generate more than 1,000 watts, which is comparable to a small space heater. For room heating purposes, you can substitute the company of 10 friends with one intensely exercising person. External heat sources offer a less convenient solution, since they must be lugged around. They're like the difference between knowing the multiplication table by heart and having to use a calculator. The modern solution is the electric blanket. For half a monthly heating bill, you can buy a heating blanket that will reduce your central heating bills forever. An older, less expensive, and therefore harder to find solution is the hot water bottle. As an alternative, you can use a rice bag. Take an old pillowcase and sew in a few cups of uncooked rice. Heat this in the microwave. The heat capacity isn't as good as the hot water bottle. These heat sources should be covered by an insulating layer or you'll lose more than half the heat. With the hot water bottle, you can simply stuff it under your sweater. Preventing heat loss is as important as generating it in the first place. This is where adding layers of clothes outside the body comes in handy. It's important to add layers preemptively. If layers aren't added, the body will withdraw blood from the limbs to save heat. Once this happens, and you've got cold feet, the blood will not return and reheat the feet even after you put on extra socks. In this case, heat must be generated in the feet by stamping, walking, jumping, or on the feet by rubbing them. An alternative is to use biofeedback. This requires some practice. Concentrate on your feet and imagine they're in warm water or you're standing on hot coals. It may take a few minutes to get it to work, and it may take several months of practice to learn to control it. Air doesn't conduct heat well, and layers trap air. Thus, trapping air prevents heat transfer to or from the environment. If you stick your hand into an oven at 100 degrees Celsius, 212 degrees Fahrenheit, you won't get burned immediately. If you touch 100 degrees Celsius water, you'll get burned immediately. Water conducts heat very well. This is also why damp clothes feel colder and why staying dry is important for staying warm. Conversely, if you want to cool down, sweat or add water exogenously. Causing water to evaporate will cool you even faster. Evaporation can be encouraged by convecting away the air with a high relative humidity around your skin. This is the basis of the swamp cooler, a simple system that you can build yourself, though it only works where the relative humidity is low, which is useful if you can't sweat enough on your own. If you can, a fan will do. These days most fans are electric, but you can get a hand fan. You should also wear loose clothing to aid in convection when you move. Conversely, in cool temperatures, wear constricting clothes, like neckties and cuffs, to seal off air movements. Given standard-sized rooms, focus on heating and cooling the body rather than the room. Heating unused rooms isn't harmonious with financial independence, as money is being wasted, nor are large rooms. If you have the choice, go with smaller rooms. Small, around 100 square feet per person, well-insulated rooms can be heated and cooled at almost no cost. Consider this along with future projections of the cost of heating oil. It may be useful to know that should the central heating be switched off for whatever reason, you can approximate a small room by pitching a tent in your living room and sleeping in that. Without the benefit of small rooms, heating and cooling means changing habits to be more in tune with the seasons. That is, letting the room temperature follow the outside temperature more closely. The barrier here is that modern people live in bubbles, only spending trivial amounts of time outside their offices, houses, cars, and shopping centers. Modern sedentary habits have almost eliminated physiological advantages and adaptation. How to dress and behave for seasons and weather have been forgotten, and so people own improper clothing which is uncomfortable outside the range of modern room temperature. By wearing the right clothes and changing a few habits, it takes about 2 weeks to adapt physiologically.